Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. We are very grateful to have the Rav answering our questions this evening. Bichvot Rav, many thanks to the Rav for giving up his time. I just wanted to go over a few rules of the Q&A for those who are new to this. So if everyone could please stay on mute unless I tell you to unmute yourself. The way it works is that people have very kindly submitted their questions in advance. So when we get to that question, I will ask it out loud, and after the Rav has given the answer, I will allow the questioner to unmute themselves if they want something clarified. If you yourself did not submit the question, but you have a follow-up question, then please send me a direct message through Zoom, and if there's time, I'll ask it. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through everyone's questions this evening, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. We did get many questions, and we only have about an hour, so thank you for your understanding. So with the Rav's permission, we're going to start with the first questions, which are on the topic of Shmita. The first one is, what is the Rav's view on the correct way to observe Shmita? He's given a few. This is from Shimon Moshe Hecht in Ma'ale Ephraim. He's given a few different options, which I'll post in the chat.
So the options mentioned here are Usar Beth Din, Yivul Nukhri, or heter mechira. There is also the question of Masam Nuthak and Aravad Duromit, etc. So we'll try and cover these various points. The concept of Usar Beth Din is not, as some people might think, a hidush of this generation. It is something which is already mentioned in the Tosefta, and the underlying concept is very simple and also very powerful. In other words, the Torah talks about loth izra, sadecha loth izra. Do not plant your field. It's talking to the Jew, the individual Jew who owns a field. Do not do these things during the year of Shemitah. But if the field is given over, the field or the orchard, etc., is handed over, made the property of the Beth Din, the Beth Din is allowed to run the affairs of that field, of that orchard, during the year of Shemitah. It is allowed to hire workers to, shall we say, pick the produce, harvest the produce. Today, of course, this means it has to be harvested and it has to be taken to a packing house. It has to be perhaps washed. It has to be selected. The fruit, shall we say, of different sizes have to be separated. The produce has to be packed. Then it has to be transported to market, wherever it has to go. All these things, of course, cost money. The Beth Din, first of all, is not the object of the Miswah of the Torah. The Beth Din is really just an entity, shall we say, a non-human entity. It does not have the status of the human owner of the field or the orchard. It is an entity, the purpose of which is to bring that produce to market where it can be, so that people can find it and consume it. Keep in mind that it is a miswah, minat Torah or midivrei soferim, depending on whether Shemitah is minat Torah or midivrei soferim, to eat the peroth of Shvi'ith, to eat the produce of Shnat HaShemitah is a miswah. So the Beth Din is allowed to do so. The Tosefta speaks of this explicitly, and this is the ideal solution for Shnat HaShemita. The ideal would be that all the fields, all the orchards, all agricultural activity in Eretz Yisrael would be handed over to and be conducted under the auspices of the Beth Din. And the Beth Din, of course, would know what melachot, what activities are mutar and which are asur, and if there are certain activities that it is mutar to do al yedei goy, then they could hire a non-Jew to do certain things if necessary. The overall concept is a very good one. It provides, on the one hand, parnasa for those who normally make their living by growing produce for their fellow Jews, and it also provides it allows that produce to get to market and get to people's homes, which is the idea. There is no miswa that the food rot on the tree or fall to the ground and become spoiled, or that the produce in the field stands and is allowed to go to waste. That would be bal tashchit, that would be asur. So osar beth din is the ideal solution. There is an organization called Osar Haaretz, which has been gearing up towards and preparing for this Shnat HaShemita. I recommend to all people to join this, to become a subscriber and to join this organization. The rules and how this works and how you become a subscriber and where you can purchase this produce is all laid out on their website, or you can speak to them. It's quite straightforward. I also heard just the other day that in certain places, I heard about the Rami Levi supermarket in Gush Etzion, for example, that all the produce there will be Osar Beth Din. I'm not sure if it's the same organization I just mentioned or a special Rami Levi Osar Beth Din, but that I understand is how it is being done. That is the ideal. Yevul Nochri is definitely a possibility, but there is a difference between Yevul Nochri and Yevul Oyevim. I have no problem with buying a potato from Nochri. I have a problem buying potatoes from Oyevim, from our enemies, whoever they may be and wherever they may be. So if certain things are imported from chatzerot, and anyhow, some produce every year is imported from overseas, that is okay. But I do not think that Shnat HaShemita should become a boon, an economic windfall for our enemies. We should do everything in our power to do quite the opposite, to curtail the ability of our enemies to sustain themselves in Eretz Yisrael, and thus cause them to leave. That should be our policy. Mothar Menuthak is another possibility, which refers to the following. In the concept of Mothar Menuthak is that the produce does not grow in the ground, the actual ground, but rather over the ground is spread a sheet, something usually made of polyethylene or some other plastic substance, a thick substance which does not allow for roots to grow through that substance, or for water to come up from the ground or to go through that material. That is the general concept of Mothar Menuthak. Excuse me. And in order to make this possible, it also has to be inside a structure. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, there is a question raised whether it is mutar to grow things inside a house. In other words, if you keep in mind in those days, your average home, except of wealthy people, the floor was made of beaten earth. So can you grow a plant which is rooted in the soil of your house, a house, which is surrounded by walls and a roof, because it's not a field. The house is not a field. On the other hand, it is land. It is the land. So this is the suffix. So it is eretz. The Torah speaks of the land, of haderech, being allowed to rest. On the other hand, also speaks about, so the chalot tizra speaks about one's field. A house is not a field. So although there are various opinions, but I suggest that we accept the psak of Hagaon Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal and many others, namely that a masam menuthak inside a house, or what we call a hamama in Hebrew, a hothouse, which is a fairly permanent structure. These structures last for many years. This is permissible. So if it is both on a masam menuthak, not in the ground, it is usually in a kind of a pot, some kind of plastic or other container, which is then raised above the ground. And sometimes they place these pots on top of metal strips, and under that they have this plastic material, as I explained, and it's covered. It has walls around it and is covered from above. So it's both inside a structure and it is also not on the ground. That is permissible, certainly, as long as we assume, and this is a correct assumption at the present time, that Shmita is not mineh Torah. In order for Shmita to be mineh Torah, there are two basic conditions. A, that a majority of the Jewish people in the world reside in Eretz Yisrael. Frankly, it is difficult to know if that in fact is the case at the present time. I think we're very close to that reality, but it is difficult to know. Certainly not all the Jews that are frequently referred to as Jews in many countries today, in North America, for example. Many of the people often counted in various demographic studies as Jews are unfortunately not Jews, not halachic Jews. Nevertheless, it's difficult to know exactly what the numbers are, but again, I think we're certainly close to that figure. That's only one condition. The other condition is that the land be divided amongst the tribes. In fact, I feel I must mention another topic, and that is, which is related, I think, it's related to our general situation. In other words, the fact that we live in a country which is not based on Jewish concepts and Torah principles, and B, it has a lot to do with the Shnat HaShemitah. 97% of the land in the current state of Israel belongs to the state, and a person who, shall we say, buys a home is actually buying a long-term lease. Is this a Torah concept? Is this how the Torah believes that the Jewish homeland should be run? My answer to that is very simple. No, that is not how it should be. Land should be owned by the Jewish people, by individuals, and by the tribes. This has to, the Jewish people should somehow be divided and taken stock of, and land should be allotted to people, all the land throughout the country. When these things are done correctly, and the majority of the Jews live in Eretz Yisrael, then Shmita will be mineh Torah. Those are the basic halachic stipulations. At this time, according to the vast majority, if not all Poskim, essentially, Shmita is at most midivrei soferim. There are even opinions that it is perhaps not even that, but it is minhag. There are some Rishonim who hold that opinion, but the general understanding is that it is midivrei soferim. So as long as it is midivrei soferim, and this is what Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal writes, and again, many agree with this position. it is mutar to grow produce on a raised, separated infrastructure, which is also inside some kind of structure, inside a hothouse, etc. I think we have covered most of the points. There is the question of the arava hadromith. There is room, I think, to be more mekel with regards to the arava hadromith. That's without going into further detail.
Thank you, Harav. Shimon Moshe, do you have anything to be clarified there?
No, everything's being clarified. Thanks. Thank you very much, Harav.
Thank you. Harav, just to clarify for some people, the Rav hasn't mentioned today the issue of heter mechira, but has spoken about it at length in the past.
Yes.
I think a question that comes up a lot for people who want to who prefer to avoid heter mechira, they go to someone's house or someone and they're served heter mechira vegetables. What's the Rav's view on that? Is it still mutar to eat it? Is it potentially to be hin? What's the Rav's view on that?
Yes, you're correct. We did not mention heter mechira. Heter mechira is definitely not an ideal solution, and I think it is to be avoided. But I would not say that it is definitely asur. Yesh al malismoch. Those who wish to rely on the heter mechira, yesh lahem al malismoch.
Okay. Thank you, Harav. The next question is from Baruch Kogan in Kfar Tapuach. Is it okay to grow vegetables in a hydroponic system which is open to the sun and rain from the top with no overhead cover during Shmita? The reason I ask is that some people express the opinion that the whole growth system needs to be indoors, even if the plants are growing in water or a growth medium completely separated from the earth.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to know what a growth medium is. If it's hydroponic, if it's in water, then the answer is that hydroponics are entirely mutar during Shnat HaShemitah. The Torah speaks about growing on the land, in the earth of Eretz Yisrael. That which grows in water is not growing by definition in the earth, as long as it is just water and nutrients that are present in the water which allow the plant to grow. It is not considered that it is growing in the earth or in any kind of field or in the land of Eretz Yisrael at all. There is a book called Derech Emunah, I believe it's called, a sefer, which lists questions that Hagaon Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, Shem Yehayehu Chayamehu, asked of the Machon Shilo, and he asked him about this very question. And the Machon Shilo there is recorded as having said to him that hydroponically grown produce is not hayav b'shmita. There's no kedushat shvi'it, and it's not hayav b'ma'asrot. So it is entirely mutar. If it's, I'm not sure I know what a growth medium is or what's being referred to in this particular case, but if it's hydroponic, which I understand means water plus certain nutrients that are introduced into the water, then it is entirely mutar. It does not need to be inside a structure. It does not have to be covered. It can be open to the sky, to the elements.
Okay, thank you. I don't see that we have Baruch on the call, so I'll move on to the next question, which is about prozbul. When should one do prozbul? Before the Shemitah year starts or towards the end of it? That's also from Shimon Moshe Hecht in Ma'aleh Ephraim. All
right. Well, the halacha is straightforward enough that Shnat HaShemitah meshametet b'sofa. In other words, the act of hashmatat ahov, shemitat ahov, occurs at the end, the very last moments of Shnat HaShemitah. So not now, but in over a year from now, just before eruv Rosh Hashanah, as the following Rosh Hashanah is about to enter. that is when the hov is nishmat. So the prozbul has to be done before that. There is the opinion of the Rosh that even though the actual act of Shmita takes place, it kicks in, so to speak, at the end of the year of Shmita, already from the beginning of the year of Shmita, one should not collect one's debts from those who owe him money. So that is something to be taken into account as well. Prozbul is usually done at the end of the year, but there is nothing preventing you from doing so even at the beginning of the year, to fit in, to take into account the opinion of the Rosh.
Thank you, Eruv. Shimon Moshe, anything to clarify?
No, thank you very much.
Great, excellent. So we're going to move on to some questions now about Shabbat. This is the first one is from Binyamin Lemkin in Ramat Bet Shemesh. Can one clean one's glasses with a wet cloth on Shabbat?
Yes, one may. I imagine the question is being asked because of the hashash, or the notion that if there is, shall we say, water on the glasses, and then one takes a cloth of some kind and dries that water and cleans, as one does so when it's cleaning the glasses, that this would perhaps be some kind of kibus of the cloth in question. Well, first of all, one can avoid the question by using a tissue or something of that nature, paper towel, etc. But the fact is, even if it's a cloth, I do not believe that is considered kibus at all, because quite the opposite is happening. If anything, the cloth is becoming dirtier, not cleaner. The glasses are becoming cleaner, and the cloth is becoming dirtier. And usually the amount of water involved is also not such that it could possibly constitute kibus. You need to have a certain minimal amount of water for kibus. I mean, it's true if you speak about a tiny spot of let's say some food substance was somehow splattered onto one's shirt, shall we say, a small spot, and you want to take just a small amount of water and rub it into that spot to clean that spot off, that would be kibus, yes, because the shirt is becoming cleaner even with a small amount of water. But the cloth that you're describing to clean the glasses, that would need a great deal more water. And even if, again, that's not the intention. The intention here is to clean the glasses and that the cloth becomes dirty, and eventually it will become dirty. So in brief, the answer is yes.
Can you even put the cloth under the tap to get it wet and then clean it, or do you have to put the water on the glasses?
That I would not. Right. I would not think is mutar, but one can wash the glasses with water, soap and water, and shake off the excess water, and whatever's left one can dry off with the cloth or the tissue.
Thank you. Binyamin, anything to be clarified?
No, thank you.
Great, thank you. So the next question is Binyamin again. Can one take vitamins or medications on Shabbat?
This is an interesting question. The general opinion is at least with regards to many medicines, the answer would be no. But I have always wondered about this myself. First of all, vitamins and medications are not the same thing necessarily, because something which is taken, something which is done by people who are healthy, as opposed to people who are unwell, in other words, drinking a certain substance or doing a certain thing, which is something that healthy people do, is not considered refu'ah, because it's derech bri'im, it's something that healthy people do. Medical procedures or taking medications is something that people who are unwell do. So taking vitamins is something that is a daily regimen usually. People do it all the time. People who are healthy do it, and they wish to remain healthy by so doing. And so vitamins are definitely mutar, in my view, on Shabbat. With regards to medications, seeing that the whole isur of not using medicines on Shabbat has to do with shechikat samamim, in other words, taking various substances, as things were in ancient times, herbs, leaves, spices, and what have you, which a person would usually crush with some water or some other liquid, depending on what one was trying to prepare, and would crush and mix it together and make into a kind of a paste. Shall we say a person had a wound, a cut on their hand. So they would make some kind of paste from various spices and herbs and that they knew to be medicinal, and create a kind of paste, a melukuma, and then smear it on the wound and wrap it up. And that act of shechikat samamim or samanim is asur on Shabbat. But who of us, when was the last time one of us made a paste or a cream in that way to treat a wound or anything of the sort? I very much doubt that any of us have ever done so. And the same is true of all the medications that we take nowadays. This was not the case, obviously, in ancient times. And in fact, medications are a relatively modern invention, as recent as 150 years at the most, and even less, I think. Many of the substances that were offered prior to that time were very often things along the lines of snake oil. In other words, all kinds of quackery, which really didn't do anything except enrich the person who was selling it to an unsuspecting public, where they were actually not medications at all. And sometimes they were downright dangerous. This is well documented. Modern pharmacology is a relatively new idea, and it's not without its problems. And the pharmaceutical industry is a problematic industry, but that's another discussion. But as long as we're talking about medications that are safe and that are necessary, I doubt whether the isur of shechikat samamanim should apply at a time when this is not our practice at all. When there's no hashash that a person will do such a thing, simply put. So I think that medications should be, one should be able to use them on Shabbat. Certainly in the case of medication that the doctor prescribes that has to be taken regularly, shall we say twice a day, and by missing a day, this may render the treatment ineffective or insufficient. Certainly, then I think there's no question it can be used on Shabbat. If it's not necessary on Shabbat, one can put it off till Motzei Shabbat. One can take one just before Shabbat, and one can take one after Shabbat. That's also a possibility in many cases. But where not, I think it should be mutar to take it on Shabbat as well.
Thank you, Harav. Benjamin, anything to clarify there?
Well, I just noticed somebody else wrote in the chat something that connects, and maybe it is an interesting question. If it's something like Tylenol, which is just sort of like a pain reliever, maybe that would fall in the category of, well, if it's really necessary, yes, but if it's not, put it off.
Again, even more so when a person is suffering significant discomfort, I think that's even a more cogent reason to say that it is permissible.
Okay, thank you, Harav. Benjamin, was that all your questions? Anything more?
Yes, thank you. No, thank you.
Very good. Okay, we now have a question from Nehemiah Davis. Is it permissible to tear toilet paper on Shabbat, or should a person have them torn before Shabbat?
It should be done before Shabbat. If one finds oneself in a situation where there is no other toilet paper available, then mishum kavod habriyot, it is mutar to tear the paper b'shinui. So if one usually does it with one's right hand, one can do it with one's left hand, or with one's teeth, etc. That's the answer in brief.
Thank you. Do we have Nehemiah on the line? I don't think so. Okay, so the next one is from an anonymous person in Jerusalem. I'm going to post it in the chat because it's quite a long question. Here it is. Essentially, the question is, well, I'll start reading. When Shabbat comes in several hours before our usual dinner time, my family has the following practice in order to ensure our food for dinner is hot. We place already cooked food in the oven about half an hour before Shabbat and turn the heat to maximum. A few minutes before Shabbat, we turn the oven off. The food then stays in the closed oven until we are ready to eat. While we learned this method from observant friends, I've had my doubts as to whether there may be an issue of hatmana. It seems clear to me that the closed oven is mosif hevel, and if so, when we cook, we try to make sure that the food is thoroughly cooked so that keeping it in longer will result in mishtamek viralo. Is this a sufficient method for avoiding the issue of hatmana? And might another way to avoid the issue of hatmana be to open the oven door slightly just before shkiya and then close it just after shkiya, since hatmana is permitted ben machot?
A good question. Briefly, placing it in the oven before Shabbat and closing the door before Shabbat is definitely hatmana, certainly if it's turned up to maximum, as is described here in the question. If it was the heat was considerably lower than maximum, then it might not actually be mosif hevel, it might just maintain a certain level of warmth. But if it's very hot, it's certainly mosif hevel. The solution that is suggested by the person who asks this question is actually, I think, a good solution. In other words, you can turn on the oven before Shabbat and turn it off just before Shabbat, and leave the door open slightly, but as is suggested here, just before the shkiya, and then when it is ben machot, one can close the door of the oven, because it is in fact mutar. Hatmana is mutar ben machot. That what the person writes in the question is very correct. So, but on the other hand, when the door is open, it's not considered hatmana. Hatmana is only considered hatmana when it is the pot in question, shall we say, is completely surrounded and covered by the substance or the whatever it is that's keeping it hot. In this case, it's the hot air of the oven, the closed space of the oven. If the door is open slightly, and it's not completely mutman, so it seems to me. So I think that's actually a very elegant solution to the gezerah of hatmana. So I think that's a good way to proceed.
Thank you. The next question was for me. What does one have to do in order to get a non-Jew or Mahalel Shabbat to be mevatel reshut for the purposes of making an eruv chatzerot? Must one ensure the non-Jew or Mahalel Shabbat does not make use of the public space, for example, corridor?
All right, so the basic halacha is that bitul reshut does not require kinyan. It does not have to be in writing. It can even be ba'al peh. In other words, if the person simply states, reshuthi mevatel lachem, my reshut is handed over to you, that statement is sufficient, unless that person then very demonstrably and deliberately does something to indicate that he retracts that statement. So if it is obvious to us that by using the public area, that is to say the corridor, for example, that floor, which is common to the people on that floor, that area, if it's obvious to us that the person uses that space by way of declaring that I retract what I said before, then that retraction is in fact a retraction. that act is a retraction of that reshut, because the bitul reshut was a maaseh kal, and this is also a maaseh kal. It doesn't require much to undo a statement of that kind. On the other hand, as long as it is not clear that the person is doing so deliberately, they just place something there without thinking, because they don't really understand what it's all about. They say what they said, and they maybe they're quite happy to do it, but they don't understand all the ramifications. And they may place something outside their door in the corridor without meaning to retract what they said before. That does not mevatel the bitul of the reshut. So one does not have to remove every article of that person that they may have placed in that area. It also occurs to me to state that even though it's clear that it is sufficient to declare ba'al peh, bitul reshut ba'al peh is sufficient, but buildings where you have several floors and many residents, such buildings usually have what's called in Hebrew a takanon of some kind, a written document which spells out certain things about the property which is owned in common by the residents, by those who reside in that building. So as it refers to the parking area, perhaps, and the courtyard, and then the other common areas. Where there is such a document, it seems to me quite possible and doable to include such a statement in the takanon, that people who are not Shabbat observant hereby declare that they mevatel their reshut on Shabbatot, etc., in those areas, to those who are shomer Shabbat, for the purpose of being able to be mosi dira la hatzer, or what have you, and that is part of the agreement by which people lived in that building together. So if such a thing can be drawn up, that may be an ideal way to do it. But ba'al peh is sufficient. There's no question about that. It is sufficient that the person says reshut be mevatel lachem.
But either way, does the non-Jew or the Mahalal Shabbat have to, when he's saying that he's being mevatel, does he have to really mean it, in the sense that he has an intention of not using that space?
I think the way to approach this would be as follows: would be to tell the person, what we require from you is that you mevatel, and you mean that during Shabbat it is you have no reshut in that space, but we agree to allow you to place certain things there as a lifnei mishurat hadin, something like that.
Right, I see. Okay, well, thank you, Arav. We've got some questions now about Kashrut.
I
sorry.
just want to explain one more thing. The reason we're so mechir on this business of bitul reshut is because the whole concept of eruv chatzerot, etc., is midivrei soferim, and it's only that there should be a heter, so that we are aware of the concept of reshut v'reshut. So there has to be this thing there to remind us. So as long as we do this in some way, there is some heter, and therefore we are mistapek. We make do with a hoda'ah ba'al peh, etc., etc.
For a scenario such as a building, why can't we rely on the bitul reshut that the area or the city authorities does, even though we wouldn't rely on it for carrying in the street for other reasons? But why wouldn't we allow that? Why would we be able to rely on that for when there is really a reshut or a reshut yachid?
Well, first of all, some might claim, and it's debatable. It might be a claim that you could possibly sustain, that you could rely for this purpose on the bitul that is done by the representative of whatever in the area, or some such arrangement. But the fact is, the people in question are not even aware of it. In other words, to do it without them being aware at all strikes me as dubious. Whereas if they say it, at least they said it, and if they understand that it's more or less a technicality, but it's important to us that they say this, they make this statement, then that I think carries more weight. If
Right.
it's done on the sly, then it's I think questionable.
Thank you. Okay, some Kashrut questions now. Anonymous has asked, is whiskey aged in sherry casks kosher?
All right. Well, both the Minhat Yitzhak and the Groth Moshe, two major poskim of the last generation or two generations ago, deal with this question, and they say that whiskey aged in wine casks is mutar. Now, in more recent years, one comes across certain whiskeys where on the label it states that they underwent what's called a second maturation. But after already being whiskey, they were then placed in another special cask in order to impart some special flavor. And some people claim that you can detect this flavor. It's not clear that this should be different from the first case that we just mentioned, from many other whiskeys which are matured in this way. Keep in mind that this is what's called nothen ta'am, bar nothen ta'am, nat bar nat. In other words, it is not the wine or the sherry that is imparting the flavor or the color. It's often, by the way, what is the wine casks are actually doing in the usual maturation process. Often what they're doing is not imparting flavor but color. From the wine stained wood, some of that coloration then is picked up by the whiskey, but does not actually impart flavor. That is the usual case. That is why perhaps the second maturation process is a slightly different process and a bit more of a question, because there the idea is that it does in fact have some impact on the flavor. But because it is nothen ta'am, bar nothen ta'am, and I would add another svara, which I know not all Rabbani would agree to, but the fact is there is a question, there is room to ask the question, why bichlal is satham yenam of goyim who do not use wine in their religious practice, which does not include only Muslims who do not use wine, do not even drink wine, let alone use it in any religious practice, but even Christians. Now you might say, wait a second, what about the Eucharist and what about the wine and what have you that goes on in Orthodox churches, Catholic churches, etc. Yes, that is true, but according to Christianity, according to their creed, it is only the priest in that very specific context that is allowed to do this. A Christian at home does not do this, is not allowed to do this. That is the whole idea of being a priest. Why can the priest do this and the average Christian can't do it for himself? Because according to their beliefs, which goes without saying we reject entirely, but according to their belief system, a certain power has been bestowed, an authority has been bestowed upon this individual. That is in fact the concept of priesthood in the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, that he is imbued with this power. And then when he does this act with the wine, it has some significance, whereas the person, the average lay individual cannot do this. And yet we find that in the Geonim, and the Rambam writes this as well, that they write that satham yonam, in other words, wine which is clearly not used and was not set aside, it was not intended for avodah zarah, because you have to remember, in ancient times, in other words, Greco-Roman times, wine was used in their religious practice. Of course it was, but it was used by everybody. In other words, any respectable Roman family had in their backyard, they had a shrine to this or that god or goddess, and they would offer various items of food and libations of wine on this shrine in their backyard on various occasions. That is exactly the concept of satham yonam, because wine which was set aside for that purpose, that's called yenesech, because that's the aim, that's the purpose, that's the intention. This wine is set aside for that purpose. So that's clearly connected to avodah zarah, and that is asur min haTorah. Satham yonam is asur midivrei sofarim. Why? Because what happens if the Roman goy who wishes to offer such a libation to his Roman goddess in his family shrine, excuse me, what happens if he runs out of that special wine for that purpose, but he still wants to do this libation? He may send his slave down to the wine cellar and ask him to bring up a cask of the wine which is used for domestic purposes at the meal, because he ran out of the special wine. Sometimes that was the case. Because this was sometimes the case, satham yenam was also made asur like yenesech, not min haTorah, but midivrei sofarim. Now what happens if we're talking about a non-Jew whose religious system does not include using wine at all for these purposes, such as a Muslim? The Gaonim write that the wine of such a non-Jew, such as a Muslim, may not be drunk, but it may mutar b'hana'ah, asur b'shkiya, but mutar b'hana'ah is mutar to be benefited from. So you can sell it and use the money for whatever you like. Now, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Ditrani, the Reed, the well-known Rishon, questions this psak, and he says, why do we make this distinction between and say that it's asur b'shkiya va mutar b'hana'ah? Why don't we say it's if it is mutar b'hana'ah, it's also afina mutar b'shkiya, because the whole idea of satham yenam here doesn't apply, because this we're talking about a Christian now, not about a Greco-Roman who would do this sort of thing with wine. A Christian who by definition is not allowed to do this, who never does this, there is no hashash at all that the wine in his home will be used for this religious purpose. The wine in the church, yes, definitely, but wine in his home, he, as a Christian, he's not allowed to do anything of the sort. It can never become yenesech, really, and therefore even the gezerah of satham yenam should not apply. So writes the Reed. And the argument is, I think, very powerful. We, I think, can at least use this reasoning of the Reed to say that when it comes to whiskey, which undergoes a second maturation process in special wine casks, even for the purpose of imparting some flavor, seeing that it's noten ta'am bar noten ta'am, and add to this the svara and the explanation of the Reed, which I think is very convincing. At least when it comes to this, I think we should be able to rely on that reasoning and that idea, and say that this whiskey is therefore mutar.
Okay, thank you, Harav.
I would just add that this is also the widespread practice. I know that Jews all over the world, of the most, even the most ultra-Orthodox types, quite happily drink many types, all types of whiskey. Basically, one does not see, to my knowledge, religious Jews of any type who consider any type of whiskey to be asur.
Thank you, Harav. We've got a question from Baruch Kogan in Kfar Tapuach. If you have a kosher animal which has become seriously injured and needs to be put down, is it permissible to kill it in a way other than shechita?
Yes, absolutely. Shechita is a miswa and a requirement if one wishes to eat the meat of the animal. If this is being done for reasons of Bar-Hayim and to put it out of its misery, it can be killed in any way at all. It can be shot in the head or what have you. There's no requirement for shechita.
Thank you. And Lewis Gordon and Yad Binyamin, is lab-grown pork kosher? And can one say the Yerushalmi's borei mineh nefashot on lab-grown meat, or should one say shehakol?
That's a very interesting question. I saw the question some time ago when you first sent me these questions, but I haven't looked up any sources. I'm not sure that these questions have really been discussed. These are fairly new questions, but it does remind me of another question, and that is, if you take if an animal which is pregnant is shechted, and according to the halacha, the as yet unborn, but now that the animal is shechted, you can cut it open and you find a live animal. That animal is not required to be shechted, and from that, animals that are born from it also are not required to be shechted. That's the halacha. It sounds unusual, but that's the fact. Now, would it be proper would it be correct and proper to deliberately take such an animal and raise herds and herds of such animals where you could eat the meat without shechita? I do know that Hagaon Arav Shmuel Voznel Zatzal addressed this question. This I have heard of. And his view was that even though technically it sounds that it should be mutar, it just doesn't sound right that we should be able to raise herds of such animals and be able to eat meat without shechita. And now, in this case, this is a little bit different. It's not the same case. I know that. It's a different case. I would say that even though you might be able to prove halachically that laboratory grown pork is kosher, so to speak, in Yiddish we would say it's passt nicht. It's just not. It doesn't sound. It doesn't feel right, and even if it was mutar, I personally would refrain.
For Rav, there is an issue as well of ever mina chai. If the meat is continuing to be grown in the vat and they cut a piece of it out of the vat, technically that's ever mina chai.
Well, there you would have to go into the question of, is that considered high? Does this fall under the category of ever mina high or not? This is one of the questions that one could delve into and would require a lot of discussion. I have not heard poskim who have expressed a view on this subject as yet. But again, even if it were mutar, you may be right that it's, let's just say we consider it to be asur for that reason. Well, then it's asur. But even if you could prove on many levels that it should be mutar, it doesn't strike me as something that we should be interested in doing. Just as once many years ago I saw a Italian kosher restaurant, and they had some kind of a pasta dish with fake prawns. They looked a bit like prawns, and I suppose they tasted a bit like prawns, but I would not know. But I would not want. I did not want to partake of such a thing at that time, nor would I wish to today. And I have no interest in finding a way to somehow taste basar hazir, even though it might be somehow mutar. So I cannot be more definitive than that right now.
However, I think Lewis also asked about the bracha on general lab-grown meat. So I presume this would be lab-grown beef.
Right. If it's lab-grown meat or beef, then I think the bracha could be either. It could be, you could say either, just as you can do the same today, because the Yerushalmi's bracha borei mineh nefashot was apparently used at one time, even though it's fallen into disuse. But I do not see why it's a sort to reinstate that bracha. So I think it could be said, or one could say shako.
Okay, thank you, Harav. The next question is for me. At what age should one ensure a child carries out the appropriate actions between eating meat and milk?
Some of you may recall that in some shiurim quite some time ago now, I quoted two midrashim, one in Midrash Tehilim and the other in Pesikath Rabbathi, that mention a school child, a young child returning from school. Even such a young child knows that he may not eat he may not eat meat and cheese together, but he has to do something in between. So we see that even a young school child, and it doesn't specify an age there, but we know, for example, that children were taken to school to begin to learn to read around the age of 6 or 7 at the latest. Rambam discusses 6 or 7. The Talmud mentions 6. So I would say from that age, 6 or 7, based on those midrashim, we see that such a child is ready. We expect such a child to know and understand such things. So from the age of 6, I would say one is required to do that.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I'm going to skip that one because that's for me. The next one is from Binyamin Lenkin in Rama Bet Shemesh. Should one say tefillat haderech with Shem v'malchut?
There are two nushaot of tefillat haderech in Masechet Barachot. One appears in Perek Revi, and the other appears in Perek Tishei. This is an unusual phenomenon, but it is a fact. The one in Perek Revi is clearly the more Bavli version, and that which appears in Perek Tishei is apparently the earlier version, which also appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi. So it's probably the earlier version. Interestingly, the Rambam brings the one that appears in the 9th chapter and in the Yerushalmi, and not the one that appears in the 4th chapter, which is what most Rishonim and Gaonim bring. The point is that one can say either. It's mutar to say either. I mean, how can you say it's a sort to say this tefillat haderech that appears in this perek, and it's a sort to say that one? You have to say that one, or vice versa. It doesn't mean there's no halachic rationale to say such a thing. One can say either. The one that appears in Perek Revi of Barachot, which is the one that with which most people are familiar, includes a bracha, and there one should say the bracha. If that's the nusach one is saying, so one says the bracha, Baruch atah Hashem shoma'at tefillah. And if one is saying that the nusach that appears in Perek Tishei or in the Rambam or in Yerushalmi, then there is no hatima, and mimerad, this question doesn't arise. So take your pick.
Binyamin, did you have anything to clarify?
No. So in other words, this wouldn't be a case of perhaps preferring the source in the Yerushalmi over the Bavli.
As I said, I cannot imagine saying to someone, you must not say that nusach, you must say the other one. They both exist in our sources. They're both legitimate. Rambam, for example, knew obviously of both of them. And interestingly, he chose the one that appears in both Bavli and Yerushalmi, which does not include a bracha, even though all the Gaonim quote the other one. clearly, both are possible, both are mutar, both are fine. So you can really choose, do whatever you prefer.
Would it be preferable if, I mean, sometimes you get cases where you're not really sure if you should be saying tefillat haderech at this point.
All right. Well, in that case,
then
that's an extra reason to choose the one without the bracha. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Harav, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, we do.
Yes, great, thank you. This is from David in Jerusalem. Should an individual praying without a minyan recite uvar l'sion?
Uvar Sion is definitely something that was intended to be said by Sibur, not by the Yahid. It is known in Aramaic as Kedusha de Sidra, which it's a kind of Kedusha. There is a Kedusha there, Kadosh, 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 etc. This is clearly only designed for the Sibur. I do not see the purpose of the individual saying that at all. It's even questionable whether an individual should say it. But immediately after that Kedusha de Sidra, the beginning of Uvar Sion, after that, what we have in all Sidurim, including ancient Sidurim, is a selection of Pesukim. And all those Pesukim, of course, are very beautiful and appropriate and are recommended at all times. So apart from the opening of Uvar Sion with the Kedusha, the rest can definitely be said. They're just a collection of Pesukim, and that's just a wonderful thing to do at any time.
Thank you. When one is in a minyan and they're saying uvar l'sion, is there a chova on every individual to say it along with the Hazan, or is there only a chova to respond at Kadosh, 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 etc.?
The original intention was, just as with Kedusha in Birkot Kriyat Shema and in Yoser, and just as the Kedusha in the Hazarat Hashas, in Tefillat HaSibur, the original intention was always that the Sibur says only Kadosh, 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 and Baruch Kavod Hashem B'Makomo. The rest is supposed to be said by the Shliach Sibur. But we all know that unfortunately this is not what happens. This is what the Temanim do to this day, but all other Jews have basically lost the plot, as the expression goes, and all these fixed and very clear set pieces of tefillah, who says what, and what is to be said by everyone is what is to be said only by the Shliach Sibur. This has really, unfortunately, become very confused and misunderstood, so that nowadays in most places, most people say everything, and this is not correct. But this is what goes on. But the correct thing is to for the Shliach Sibur to say it aloud, and for the Sibur just to respond to Kadosh and Baruch. Now, if the person says, well, I can't hear the Shliach Sibur because everybody's saying it, well, in that case, you can say it as well, because the Shliach Sibur is not able, either he doesn't know what he's supposed to do, or even if he knows, he's not able to perform his task because other people are preventing him from doing so. So it's unfortunate. But the problem with all these practices is that it causes the whole concept of tefillah b'sibur to unravel. The way the whole tefillah b'sibur is supposed to operate is lost, and people just don't know anymore what's going on, and that's unfortunate. But there you are. If you want to see how it should be done, find yourself a Temani shul, go there for a little while, and you'll see how they do it without any discussion, without thinking about it twice. That's what they've always done. That is what Hazar intended, and that is the wonderful thing about the Temanim, that in many respects they were able to preserve, almost as it were, to take a snapshot of the ancient past and preserve it for us down to this day.
Okay, thank you very much to the Rav for answering all our questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and I hope it's been very useful for everyone, and I hope we're able to do more of these. And just a final thanks to the Rav for giving up his time.
Thank you, Rav.
Kol tov lachem, hizku v'ames levavchem kol hamehalim Adonai.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.